But see, here's where, thanks to Tom Luckshow, he has, for 3 decades, been tirelessly doing this research on the history of openness and has amassed just some fantastic things. We have over there, I asked Tom about 3 or 4 months ago, could you put your research down into a timeline, an annotated timeline, that we could just kind of look at for this conference, and he was kind enough to do that. And so if you don't have one of those, I encourage you to get it. It's just so informative, because what Tom has shown is that the openness theology is as old as the Reformation itself. Older, because now you can count Chalcidius, but that it's been actually very, very widespread. And so I think we owe Tom a word of thanks here. And Tom, could I ask you to come up here just for 1 minute? Come on up here, Tom. Come here. Come here. Give this guy a hand. Come over here. Okay, this guy, I think you are a hero in my book. And this is the guy, tireless research. So I just want to ask you a few questions, if you don't mind. What was it that got, now, are you a historian by trade?
I am not a historian, and I am not a theologian, and I hope that by the end of this conference, you don't say that's the most intelligent thing I said all evening.
What do you do for a living?
I'm an attorney.
Attorney. And so when do you find time to do all this research?
Well, most of it has been done in the past, but I still, in my spare time, try to, now that so much is available online, still try to snoop around.
All right. And this guy has been gracious enough to send everything he's found. He Xeroxes and sends me a copy of it and John a copy of it. Do you send anyone else a copy of it?
Just you two guys.
Oh, we are blessed. Honestly, I've got, well, he's got the library back there, all those books back there, but I've got piles and piles and piles of this stuff, and I haven't read most of it. But have you read most of it?
I can't estimate how much I've read. I've read a considerable amount of it. Much of it is so difficult to read. You have to soak your brain in it to train it to understand it.
That's true. Yes, I've tried. It's like reading somebody with a strong lisp.
Yes.
F's, all the S's are F's. It's the craziest thing.
I'm sufficiently familiar with it, though, that I can probably talk about it.
It's like learning a different language. What would you say is like the most interesting argument you've found, or is there a interesting person that you found?
Well, I was just reflecting when you were talking about the origin of the Hellenistic concept of God, that James Jones in 1828 was arguing the same thing, that it's heathen origin, and he traces it back just like you do. It doesn't necessarily mention the same individuals, but he pinpoints it there also.
All right. So, is there anything that you have found that they argue? Like, one of the things I noticed right away in reading Fancourt was how similar his arguments are to contemporary open theists.
Yes,
have you found anything that they argue that we are missing?
Well, the problem I've discovered is that each new generation of open theists has to reinvent the wheel. They don't seem to be familiar of the preceding generation.
I know, yeah.
There are a few exceptions, but yeah, unfortunately, they just seem to come up with the same basic arguments, and the later guys don't build on it.
All right. Well, maybe we can finally start to change that. Thanks to you. Thanks to you. Appreciate it. Give this guy a hand. I appreciate that, man. And so you'll see on that timeline that there's just a wealth of information there, and some of these folks are just spectacular. One thing was discouraging to me is I read Andrew Ramsey's article in the the Arminian Journal, which John Wesley was the editor of, and he argues for an open view of the future, mainly along philosophical lines, and he anticipates an argument that I've used, what I've called the infinite intelligent argument, which is basically that if God is infinitely intelligent, and if you assume freedom, then only a God of finite intelligence would gain any providential advantage by virtue of knowing one single future certain timeline as opposed to any number of possible timelines. Because if he's infinitely intelligent and you can't divide up infinity, then he doesn't have to spread his intelligence thin to cover the possibilities. So he can look at each and every one of a trillion possibilities as though it was an absolute certainty. And I thought that was a novelty, and I was very proud of myself. Ramsey beats me by 150 years. You think you get a new thought, and there it turns out to be nothing. One other thing is Tom, I don't know if you can correct me on this, but as I look through through this, some of the journal stuff you sent, I see these folks debated each other in a pretty hot way, but I never saw the term heresy used. See, and that amazed me. It shows you how things have changed, where today folks are so quick to hit that heresy button, where in the past they debated this far and wide, but they didn't call each other heretics. And I wish we could get back to some of what they had back then. The other thing that's interesting about some of these works is that the way they talk, it makes it clear that they weren't at all just isolated individuals, that this is fairly widespread. Even James Owen, in his work, he's critical of Arminianism, but the way he speaks, it's clear that the Remonstrants, who were this radical Arminian group, that most of them, he says, denied that God had exhaustive, definite knowledge of the future. So we are really indebted to that. I am not aware of, and there's more work to be done on this, and Tom needs to write a book on this, or somebody is going to take your work and write a book on it, but we need a book on this untold section of church history. I'm not aware of the goings-on in the 20th century, especially the first half of the 20th century. I've had several folks give me some quotes from Finis Dake's Bible. Anyone here listen? Did you? There's two quotes that people have sent me that he had a kind of foreknowledge, or a sort of an open view. But it seems like it was that odd view that Adam Clarke had, where God chooses not to know some things about the future, which I understand Dallas Willard also kind of holds, maybe, sort of. But I've never understood that, because wouldn't God have to know what he doesn't want to know before he decides not to know it? And what good would it do for God not to know it? If the fact's already out there, that's the problem. Whether God knows it or not, it's kind of inconsequential. But at least he held, he was trying to deal with some of these passages that deal with the openness of the future. But then in the 50s, Loren Cunningham was the founder of YWAM. He starts this off with this open view of the future, and it was, he felt in the early years was essential to prayer and to evangelism. And so YWAM was birthed with that conviction of the openness of the future. Alan McBrien is here this weekend. This is an old-time YWAMer. It's so good to have you here. And if you have any questions about the old YWAM crowd, he's been teaching open theism on YWAM for, I mean, you guys must be sitting around this saying, these evangelicals finally are getting it. They're calling it new. We've been doing this for years. But then in the 80s, Walter Martin, who ran the Christian Research Institute and had that very widely read book, The Kingdom of the Cults, he threatened to put YWAM in and classify it as a cult if they didn't stop teaching the open view of the future. And since that would have destroyed YWAM, and Loren Cunningham thought we're called to be, for missions, not to be, just about this particular doctrine. They backed off of that. And now are worried about the encroachment of Calvinism in their movement. But they also were carrying that mantle. And then it seems to me that the first rumblings of the current evangelical openness movement, first was probably this Howard Elseth's strange book, Did God Know, in 1977. And then Richard Rice came up with a book in the mid-'80s, God's Foreknowledge and Man's Free Will. And so these were the first two that were kind of getting the ball rolling among evangelicals on this. In the 80s, and I can't piece this together yet, but it seems like a lot of people unrelated to each other just started to get this. I can only speak from my own perspective, but between 1984 and 86, I transitioned out of my Bardian Calvinism into what was pretty much an open view, although I didn't let go of my Calvinist view of election until 1987 for exegetical reasons, until I could finally figure out how to read Romans 9 in a way that was consistent with open theism. But I thought I was totally alone in that. Like I'm just the odd guy out. And then, except for I came across Richard Rice's book, I think about a year later. And then a year after that, Clark Pinnock published his article, God Limits His Knowledge, in '89. And so I'm beginning to think, okay, there's a few other oddball people out there. And then in '92, I meet Clark Pinnock out in San Francisco. And that's when I learned for the first time that there's a number of other people who also, he tells me, all during the '80s were getting this. And that they had already had a book in process on it called The Openness of God. And that, as I mentioned earlier, was considered usually the inauguration of the contemporary openness movement among evangelicals. As I said, it was wild and crazy those first few years. It was really interesting. I had 2 years, 99 and 2000, where certain pastors were circling the wagons around Bethel University, trying to get me fired from Bethel or trying to get Woodland Hills Church taken off the roll of the Baptist General Conference. Like anybody at the church cared about that. But that's what they're trying to do. I know John fought some fights up in Bemidji. And then there was the time where John and I and Clark all got charged with heresy at the ETS, the Evangelical Theological Society. Although it turns out, had forgotten to register, so I wasn't, you can't kick me out, I wasn't a member. Sometimes being forgetful comes in handy. But yeah, so there's a lot of those storms that went on, and it was kind of exciting and sometimes harrowing. But that brings us to where we are now. The storm has settled, and it's time to regroup. It's time to talk amongst ourselves. It's time to ask other questions like how does this open view relate to other aspects of the doctrine of God? How does it relate to the atonement? What about soteriology? How does it interface with evolution theory? How does it relate to eschatology? And start to compare relationships with other theological beliefs. One thing I'm sure of, and that is that unlike previous openness movements, and there's been, as Tom pointed out, a number of starts and stops with this. But here's what's different. The world has changed. The whole gestalt of the world is different now. We live in, up until very recently, we had this very strong cultural determinism going on, thanks largely to the philosophical assumptions that were in play in ancient Greece. Add to that Newtonian science, which was very deterministic. It makes our openness forefathers all the more impressive, because they had to buck a cultural current to embrace this open view. But see, now things have changed quite drastically in the last 100 years, especially the last 50 years. You still have segments of science that operate with a deterministic assumption, like neuroscience and genetics. They tend to be deterministic. But other branches of science are moving in a very indeterministic direction. Everything from evolution theory to quantum mechanics, to systems theory, complex adaptive systems, emergent property theory, non-equilibrium thermodynamics. All these areas are moving in an indeterministic direction. And now words like contingency and chance are not taboo in science. In fact, they use them all the time. In fact, the dominant view that's arising is that everything from particles to individual humans to human groups to solar systems to galaxies and on, everything is a sort of interesting play between determinism and indeterminism. At least this is the direction that the world is, that the Western world is leaning. And if history shows us anything, it's that theology is inevitably, for better or for worse, it's inevitably influenced by the categories of the culture, the dominant ideas in the academy. And if that holds true, then it means that, and this is what I suspect, is that the Calvinist outlook and any system that is, insofar as it's deterministic, I believe it's going to sound and feel increasingly arcane to people as the world is changing. And the only biblical view that is accommodated to this changing indeterministic gestalt, is the open view. That's the view that has always embraced that. So while the future is, of course, open, and who knows, I think the future of open theism is looking very, very bright. And I think we're pioneers. Everyone in this auditorium today right now is a pioneer of a view that I suspect in 100 years is going to be the dominant perspective in Christianity. Am I certain? Of course not. We're open theists. But it seems to be pretty reasonable.